History tells us powerful women were rare, that wars were fought by men, that empires were built by kings. Pause for a moment, then explain this. In the 16th century, while Europe was consumed with Renaissance politics and New World conquest deep in the heart of West Africa, one woman was doing something the world said was impossible. She expanded a kingdom through military force. She commanded cavalry armies that struck terror into rival states. She controlled trade routes that stretched across the Sahara. She built fortifications so formidable they still stand today. And she did it all not as a regent, not as a figurehead, not as someone's wife or mother, but as a sovereign ruler in her own right. Her name was Queen Amina of Zaria, and if you've never heard of her, that's not an accident. Because here's what they don't tell you in the history books. Queen Amina didn't just rule, she conquered. She didn't just inherit power, she seized it. She didn't just defend her kingdom, she expanded it through calculated, ruthless military campaigns that made grown men surrender before a single sword was drawn. So let me ask you something. Why was a woman this powerful, this strategic, this undeniably successful, almost completely erased from world history? Why do we know every detail about European kings who ruled far smaller territories, but almost nothing about an African queen who built an empire? And here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. Whose interests did it serve to bury her story? If you're here for the history they never taught you, the stories that were deliberately left out of textbooks, the truth that challenges everything you thought you knew about power, gender, and Africa, then you're in exactly the right place. Subscribe to Ancient Africa Untold, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's evidence. And the most shocking part of Queen Amina's story isn't how she ruled. It's not even what she conquered. It's who was afraid of her, and why that fear lasted for centuries after her death. Queen Amina did not rise in peace. She was born into a world of iron, horses, and war. This is 16th century Hausaland, what is now northern Nigeria and southern Niger. But forget the borders, you know. This wasn't a unified nation. This was a volatile network of competing city-states, each one a kingdom unto itself, each one hungry for dominance. Kano, Katsina, Gobir, Zaria, these weren't villages. These were sophisticated urban centers with tens of thousands of inhabitants, fortified walls, thriving markets, and standing armies. They were connected by trade routes that carried salt from the Sahara, gold from the forest kingdoms to the south, leather goods, textiles, and something even more valuable, horses. Because in Hausaland, military power rode on 4 legs. Cavalry warfare defined everything. Whoever controlled the horses controlled the battlefield. Whoever controlled the battlefield controlled the trade routes. Whoever controlled the trade routes controlled wealth. And whoever controlled wealth controlled power. This was a world where diplomacy was backed by the threat of violence, where alliances shifted like desert sand, where a moment of weakness meant invasion, conquest, absorption. Peace was temporary. War was the constant. And into this world, around the year 1533, in the kingdom of Zazzau, which we know today as Zaria, a daughter was born to the royal family. Her name was Amina. She was not born into stability. She was born into a court that understood one fundamental truth. Power is never given. It is always taken. It is always defended. And it is always contested. Her mother, Bakwa Turunku, was a princess who became queen. Already, Amina was watching a woman navigate the brutal machinery of statecraft. Already, she was learning that gender was not destiny. It was obstacle, yes, but not an absolute barrier. Her father's lineage connected her to warriors. Her mother's lineage connected her to rulers. But bloodline alone meant nothing in Hausaland. Because here's what you need to understand. This was not a world of peaceful successions and ceremonial crowns. This was a meritocracy of violence. Leaders were forged in combat. Respect was earned with strategy. Authority came from results, and from the very beginning, Amina was different. While other royal children were learning court etiquette and marriage politics, Amina was watching the soldiers. While other princesses were being prepared for diplomatic marriages that would secure alliances, Amina was asking questions about cavalry formations and siege tactics. In a world where power was earned with blood, where weakness was punished with conquest, where survival itself required military strength, what kind of woman chooses to become a warrior? By the time Amina could ride a horse, she was already training for war. And the court had no idea what they were creating. While other princesses were trained in diplomacy, Amina trained with soldiers. Let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't a hobby. This wasn't a rebellious phase. This wasn't performative. Amina made a calculated decision that would define her entire life. She would master the tools of power that mattered in her world. And in 16th century Hausaland, that meant war. She learned to fight with swords, spears, and daggers. She learned to ride, not the ceremonial riding of royalty, but combat riding, the kind where your horse is not transportation but weapon, where you need to control 1,000 pounds of muscle while wielding iron, where a single mistake means death. She studied tactics, formation warfare, cavalry charges, supply lines, psychological warfare, the architecture of sieges. She trained alongside the soldiers who would one day serve under her command. And here's what's crucial. They respected her, not because she was royal, not because it was required, but because she could do what they could do, and eventually she could do it better. But this created a problem, because the male nobles were watching. The traditional elders were watching, and what they saw terrified them. Not because Amina was strong. Strength in a ruler was valued. Not because she was intelligent. Intelligence was respected. They were terrified because Amina represented something far more dangerous than physical capability. She represented choice. She represented the possibility that women didn't have to accept the roles that tradition assigned them, that power structures weren't natural law, they were social constructs, that the gendered division of authority could be challenged. They didn't fear her strength, they feared what she represented, and they did what threatened power structures always do. They pushed back. Warnings, concerns about propriety, suggestions that she was bringing shame to the royal house, pressure to conform, pressure to marry, pressure to accept a traditional role. But here's the thing about Amina, she understood power better than her critics did. She understood that in a world defined by military might, the person who commands loyalty from soldiers holds more real power than the person who sits on a throne. She understood that respect earned on the battlefield translates directly into political authority. She understood that every time she proved herself in combat, she was demolishing the argument that women couldn't lead armies. So the warnings continued, and Amina kept training. The concerns grew louder, and Amina kept fighting. The traditional expectations pressed harder, and Amina kept winning because she had figured out something that her critics either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge. History doesn't remember the people who followed the rules. History remembers the people who changed them. What happens when a woman refuses the role history assigns her? What happens when she's not just competent, but exceptional? What happens when soldiers start looking to her for leadership instead of to the throne? The answer came when her brother, Karama, inherited the crown, and everything changed. Amina did not become queen immediately, but she became something more dangerous. When her brother Karama ascended to the throne of Zazzau, the traditional story would have Amina fade into the background, marry a neighboring prince, become a diplomatic asset, disappear into the role that royal women were expected to play. That's not what happened. Instead, Karama did something that reveals just how formidable Amina had become. He made her Magagia, a title that translates roughly to heir apparent, but meant so much more in practical terms. He made her his military commander. Think about what that means. Karama could have chosen any general, any experienced warrior, any male noble who expected the position, but he chose his sister, not out of sentiment, not out of family obligation, because she was the best strategic mind in the kingdom. So while Karama ruled from the palace, Amina led from the battlefield, and she didn't just lead, she dominated. Campaign after campaign, she took Zazzau's armies into neighboring territories. Not defensive wars, not border skirmishes. These were calculated wars of expansion, designed to increase Zazzau's territory, secure trade routes, and establish dominance over rival states. And she won, again and again and again. Her tactical innovations became legendary. Her understanding of terrain, timing, and psychological warfare gave Zazzau advantages that superior numbers couldn't overcome. Her cavalry charges became the stuff of terror for enemy forces. And here's where the power dynamic gets fascinating. The soldiers became loyal to her. Not to the throne, not to the kingdom, to her. They followed her into battle because she led from the front. They trusted her tactical decisions because those decisions kept them alive and brought them victory. They respected her because she understood warfare at a level that transcended gender. She understood it at the level of genius. Power was shifting, quietly but undeniably. The throne still belonged to Karama, but the military, the actual instrument of state power, answered to Amina, and everyone in the court could see it happening. This is the moment where lesser rulers would have felt threatened, where insecure kings would have stripped her of command, where fear of her influence would have led to her downfall. But Karama was either wise enough or pragmatic enough to understand that Amina's success was Zazzau's success, that her military genius was expanding the kingdom's power and wealth. So the campaigns continued. Zazzau's territory grew. Tribute from conquered states flowed into the treasury. And Amina's reputation grew beyond Zazzau's borders. Enemy kingdoms knew her name. Allied states knew her name. Traders and merchants and travelers knew her name. She had become, in every way that mattered, the face of Zazzau's power. Now, here's the question that should be bothering you. If Amina was this successful, this powerful, this undeniably significant to her kingdom's expansion, why would history later pretend she was insignificant? Why would colonial historians describe her as a mythical figure, too legendary to be real? Why would textbooks barely mention her, if they mentioned her at all? Because even the historical record feared what Amina represented. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because the real story, the one that would terrify neighboring kingdoms and ultimately threaten the entire gender hierarchy of recorded history, that story hadn't even begun yet. When her brother died in 1576, after a decade of rule, the throne passed according to custom, and Amina did not hesitate. She took the crown and unleashed war. Queen Amina did not inherit peace. She unleashed war. Understand the context here. This wasn't about ascending to a throne and maintaining the status quo. This wasn't about holding territory and defending borders. This wasn't about cautious diplomacy and careful alliance building. Amina had spent a decade as military commander, watching her brother rule, understanding exactly what power looked like from the throne. She had been patient. She had been strategic. She had been waiting, and now, at her coronation, she made her intentions crystal clear. Within months, some accounts say within weeks of taking the throne, Amina launched the first of her expansion campaigns, not a defensive operation, not a response to aggression, a calculated war of conquest. And this is where her genius becomes undeniable. Because Amina didn't just command armies, she revolutionized them. She expanded Zazzau's cavalry forces, investing in horses, training, and equipment. She innovated tactics that maximized the devastating power of mounted warriors. She understood logistics in ways that kept her armies supplied and mobile across vast distances. But here's what made her truly terrifying: psychological warfare. Amina understood that the greatest victory is the one you win before the battle begins. That reputation can be weaponized. That fear can conquer cities without spilling blood. Her first campaigns were designed not just to capture territory, but to send a message. Neighboring kingdoms watched as Zazzau's cavalry appeared on their borders, disciplined, numerous, and led by a queen whose tactical reputation preceded her. And they made calculations. Could they win? Possibly. At what cost? Devastating. What would defeat mean? Destruction. What would resistance mean? Loss. And one by one, cities began to surrender without fighting. Gates opened at the sound of her name. Tribute was offered before ultimatums were issued. Alliances were requested before armies even deployed. Rumors traveled faster than her cavalry. Stories of her military genius, her relentless expansion, her refusal to accept anything less than submission. These stories became weapons themselves, softening targets before a single soldier arrived. This wasn't just conquest. This was destabilization through reputation. Within years of taking the throne, Amina had expanded Zazzau's territory to its greatest extent in history. She pushed south to the Atlantic coast. Some accounts claim she reached as far as the ocean itself, though this is debated. She pushed west, bringing kingdoms and city-states under Zazzau's control. She secured trade routes that had previously been contested, making them safe for merchants under her protection. Tribute flowed into Zazzau from dozens of subjugated territories: gold, salt, horses, textiles, labor, resources. The kingdom became wealthy beyond precedent. But here's what you need to understand. This wasn't raiding. This wasn't temporary military dominance that would collapse the moment she died. Amina was building something permanent. She was building an empire. And she understood that empires aren't built on conquest alone. They're built on infrastructure, they're built on systems, they're built on the ability to hold what you've taken and transform military victory into lasting political control. Which brings us to the most visible legacy of Amina's reign: the walls. What kind of ruler forces surrender before drawing a sword? The kind who understands that power is as much about perception as reality. The kind who knows that reputation, carefully cultivated and ruthlessly maintained, can accomplish what armies alone cannot. But if this story is changing how you see African history, if you're realizing that the narrative you were taught deliberately excluded women like this, rulers like this, empires like this, then subscribe to Ancient Africa Untold, because we're only halfway in. And what Amina did next proved she wasn't just a conqueror, she was a builder of empire. Queen Amina didn't just conquer cities, she redesigned power itself. Because here's what separates a warlord from an empire builder. A warlord takes, an empire builder transforms, and Amina transformed every territory she conquered. Her most visible legacy, the one that still exists today, the one that archaeologists and historians cannot deny, is the fortification system that became known across Hausaland as Amina's walls. These weren't simple barriers. These were sophisticated military architecture designed with defensive genius. Earthwork fortifications, sometimes stone-reinforced, that surrounded conquered cities and established military outposts. Walls that could be defended by relatively small forces against much larger armies. Walls that declared permanently that this territory now belonged to Zazzau. And here's what's crucial. These weren't just military installations, They were psychological markers. They were statements of permanence. They were visible proof that Zazzau's conquest wasn't temporary. It was the new reality. Every city that fell under Amina's control received these fortifications. Every strategic location along trade routes received these walls. Every garrison that enforced Zazzau's authority was protected by these structures. And they worked, because conquering territory is one thing, holding it is something else entirely. Amina understood that military victories are meaningless if you can't defend what you've taken. That expansion without consolidation is just expensive raiding. So she built infrastructure that could outlast her reign, that could survive succession crises, that could maintain Zazzau's dominance for generations. But the walls were only one part of her imperial system. She reorganized trade routes to flow through Zazzau. She established tribute systems that turned conquered territories into revenue streams. She placed governors and military commanders in strategic locations, creating an administrative network that could govern an empire. She negotiated or imposed trade agreements that favored Zazzau's merchants. She secured access to resources that had previously been controlled by rival states. She created economic dependencies that made rebellion costly and submission profitable. This was not raiding. This was long-term imperial strategy. This was state building at a level that requires sophisticated understanding of economics, logistics, administration, and military power. And she did it while being a woman in a world that insisted women couldn't do this. Think about what that means. Every decision she made was scrutinized differently than a male ruler's decisions would be. Every mistake would be attributed to her gender. Every success would be dismissed as luck or minimized as insignificant. And she still built an empire. She still commanded armies. She still expanded Zazzau to its greatest territorial extent. She still created infrastructure that lasted centuries beyond her death. So why don't textbooks describe this as empire building? Why is Amina's reign, when it's mentioned at all, described in vague terms, as if her accomplishments were unclear or disputed? Why do we have detailed histories of minor European nobles who ruled tiny territories, but sketchy, uncertain records of an African queen who built one of the most powerful kingdoms in West Africa? Because acknowledging the full scope of Amina's achievements would require acknowledging something far more threatening. It would require acknowledging that African kingdoms were as sophisticated as European ones, that African women could rule as effectively as any European king, that the entire narrative of African inferiority and female incapability was a lie designed to justify colonialism and patriarchy. The historical record didn't fail to preserve Amina's story by accident. It was deliberately obscured, but we're not done yet, because the more powerful Amina became, the more successful her reign proved to be, the more her empire expanded, the more dangerous the stories about her grew. And those stories tell us something crucial about how power destroys women it cannot control. When history can't deny a woman's power, it often attacks her character. This is where Amina's story gets disturbing, not because of what she did, but because of how her story was reshaped, retold, and weaponized against her. The legend that emerged centuries after her death, preserved in oral traditions that were later written down by historians with their own agendas, describes Amina as a queen who never married, who took lovers from among her conquered enemies, and who had these men executed the morning after to preserve her independence. It's lurid, it's scandalous, it's memorable, and it's almost certainly false. Or at minimum, it's a deliberate distortion designed to sexualize and delegitimize her power. Think about how male conquerors are remembered. Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, Julius Caesar. These men had multiple wives, countless lovers, complex personal lives. And how are they described in history? As great military leaders, as empire builders, as strategic geniuses. Their personal lives are footnotes. Their sexual relationships are barely mentioned. Their legitimacy is never questioned based on who they slept with. But Amina, her military genius gets reduced to a paragraph, and her supposed sexual appetite gets an entire chapter. Male conquerors were remembered as heroes. Amina was remembered as scandal. This wasn't accidental. This was reputation warfare conducted across centuries. Because here's what those myths accomplish. They shift the focus. Instead of discussing her military campaigns, people discuss her sexuality. Instead of analyzing her administrative innovations, people debate whether the lover execution stories are true. Instead of recognizing her as an empire builder, she gets categorized as an exotic, dangerous, transgressive woman. The myths make her safe to dismiss. They make her interesting without being threatening. They turn her into legend, and legends can be ignored by serious historians. They sexualize her power, and sexualized power can be minimized as aberrant rather than legitimate. This pattern repeats throughout history. Cleopatra's political genius gets reduced to her relationships with Caesar and Mark Antony. Catherine the Great's reformation of Russia gets overshadowed by fabricated sexual rumors. Elizabeth I's entire reign gets filtered through the question of why she never married. Powerful women don't get remembered for their power. They get remembered for their relationships to men, their sexuality, their conformity or non-conformity to feminine ideals. And when those narratives don't exist naturally, they get invented, because reducing a woman to her sexuality is easier than confronting the fact that she succeeded in a role that supposedly only men could fill. Now, were there grains of truth in the stories about Amina? Possibly. Did she refuse to marry? The historical evidence suggests yes. She never took a husband, which was itself a radical choice for a queen whose marriage could have secured powerful alliances. Did that refusal generate speculation, gossip, and eventually legend? Almost certainly. But here's what matters. The focus on her personal life rather than her political achievements was a choice. A choice made by the people who recorded and transmitted her story. A choice that served specific purposes. It made her story memorable, yes, but it also made her story dismissible. It turned her into a cautionary tale about women who refuse traditional roles, rather than an inspiration about women who excel in leadership. It preserved her name while burying her significance. This wasn't storytelling. This was reputation warfare conducted across time. And it worked. How many powerful women in history were reduced this way? How many queens, generals, scientists, leaders had their accomplishments overshadowed by scandalous stories designed to undermine their legitimacy? How many times has history chosen to remember a woman's personal life instead of her public achievements? Amina's story survived, barely, but it survived distorted, sexualized, made safe for a patriarchal historical narrative that could acknowledge her existence without threatening its fundamental assumptions about gender and power. But even that distorted story wasn't enough, because then something worse happened. Queen Amina vanished from history altogether, and the silence that followed was not an accident. There is no grand tomb, no monumental burial, only fragments. Here's what we don't know about Queen Amina. Exactly when she died, how she died, where she's buried, how long she ruled, the precise extent of her conquests. The details of her administration. Here's what we do know. Sometime in the late 16th century, one of the most powerful rulers in West Africa died. And then, gradually, systematically, deliberately, she disappeared from written history. The oral traditions preserved her. The Hausa people kept her story alive, passed down through generations, told and retold around fires and in courts and in songs. Her walls still stood, physical proof of her existence. Her name survived in memory. But the written record, the kind of history that colonizers would later use to justify their conquest of Africa, that history had almost nothing to say about Queen Amina. And when it did mention her, it did so with skepticism, with uncertainty, with the implication that she was more legend than fact, more myth than history. This is where the machinery of erasure takes over, because colonialism required a specific narrative about Africa. It required the belief that African societies were primitive, disorganized, lacking in sophisticated political structures. It required the myth that Africa had no history, that it was a continent frozen in time, waiting for European civilization to arrive and organize it. The existence of Queen Amina threatened that narrative, a woman who ruled through military conquest, who built an empire, who commanded sophisticated cavalry armies, who created administrative systems and economic networks and permanent infrastructure that couldn't exist in the Africa that colonialism needed to justify itself. So colonial historians did what they always did with inconvenient evidence. They questioned it. They dismissed it. They categorized it as legend rather than history. They pointed to the gaps in the written record, gaps that they themselves were creating by refusing to take oral history seriously. They demanded the kind of documentation that only literate European-style bureaucracies produced, knowing that Hausa kingdoms used different systems of record-keeping. They set standards of evidence that conveniently excluded African sources while accepting European sources uncritically. And they did this not just to Amina, but to thousands of African rulers, kingdoms, and civilizations. The transatlantic slave trade required Africans to be seen as less than human. Colonialism required Africa to be seen as backwards and primitive. Both systems required the systematic destruction, dismissal, or obscuring of evidence that contradicted those narratives. So when colonial education systems were established in Africa, they didn't teach about Queen Amina. They taught about European kings and queens. They taught about European civilization as if it were the only civilization. They taught African children that their history began with colonization. And when Western universities taught world history, they focused on Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Africa became a footnote, a source of slaves and resources, but not of culture, innovation, or power. This wasn't accidental ignorance, this was systematic erasure. And it worked so well that today, centuries later, most people have never heard of Queen Amina. Most history books don't mention her. Most curriculum standards don't include her. She built an empire, commanded armies, ruled for decades, created infrastructure that lasted for centuries, and the world forgot her name. But here's the question you should be asking. Why? Why was it so important to erase Queen Amina specifically? Because acknowledging Queen Amina meant admitting something far more dangerous than the existence of one powerful woman. If Queen Amina existed, then Africa produced women who ruled through power, strategy, and war. Let that sit for a moment, because this isn't just about one queen. This is about what her existence proves. If Amina was real, and she was, then the entire narrative of African primitiveness collapses, because you don't build empires in primitive societies. You don't command sophisticated cavalry armies in backward civilizations. You don't create lasting administrative systems in disorganized cultures. Acknowledging Amina means acknowledging that 16th century Hausaland had complex political structures, military sophistication, economic networks, and architectural achievements that rivaled anything in Europe at the same time. And colonialism couldn't allow that acknowledgement. But it goes deeper. If Amina ruled successfully, and she did, then the entire narrative of female incapability collapses. because if a woman could do this in 16th century Africa, then women could do it anywhere, anytime. The entire justification for excluding women from power, that they lack the strategic thinking, the military capability, the ruthlessness, the leadership necessary for ruling, becomes obviously false. And patriarchy couldn't allow that acknowledgement either. Queen Amina's existence threatened two different hierarchies, racial and gender. She was proof that Africans were not inferior. She was proof that women were not incapable. She was living evidence that both systems of oppression were based on lies. So she had to be forgotten, not actively destroyed, though that happened too with the burning of records, the dismissal of oral traditions, the colonial rewriting of history, but passively erased through the much simpler tactic of just not teaching her story, not including her in textbooks, not mentioning her in world history courses, not making her name as famous as Alexander or Caesar or Napoleon. And here's what's truly insidious: that erasure becomes self-perpetuating. If you've never heard of Queen Amina, you don't ask why you've never heard of her. If she's not in textbooks, students assume she's not important. If historians don't study her, other historians assume there's no evidence. The absence of her story becomes its own justification. But the evidence exists. Her walls still stand in northern Nigeria, earthwork fortifications that archaeologists can measure and date and analyze. Oral traditions preserved by the Hausa people have maintained remarkable consistency across centuries. Written records from the period, though sparse, do mention her. Later historians, once they started taking African sources seriously, found enough evidence to reconstruct the broad outlines of her reign. She existed, she ruled, she conquered, and the fact that most people don't know this tells you everything about whose history gets preserved and whose gets buried. Queen Amina wasn't erased because she failed. She was erased because she succeeded. She succeeded so completely, so undeniably, so visibly that her existence threatened the entire ideological foundation of colonialism and patriarchy. And rather than confront what her success meant, rather than acknowledge that their justifications for racism and sexism were lies, the architects of modern history chose to forget her, to minimize her, to reduce her to myth, to ensure that her story would never inspire others to question the systems that benefited from her erasure. But history has a way of resisting silence. Stories have a way of surviving, and the truth has a way of emerging, no matter how deeply it's been buried. Queen Amina was not a myth. She was not an exception. She was proof. Proof that the history you were taught was incomplete at best, deliberately falsified at worst. Proof that powerful women didn't start existing in the 20th century. They were erased from the centuries before. Proof that African civilizations were as sophisticated, complex, and powerful as any on Earth, and that acknowledging this fact threatens narratives that still shape our world today. Her walls still stand in northern Nigeria. You can visit them. You can touch the earthwork fortifications that she ordered, built more than 400 years ago. Physical proof that cannot be dismissed or explained away. Her name survives in Hausa oral tradition. Grandmothers still tell their granddaughters about the warrior queen who refused to be limited by what society expected of women. Her story persists in songs, in legends, in the collective memory of a people who never forgot her, even when the written record tried to. And now, her story is being reclaimed. Scholars are taking oral traditions seriously. Archaeologists are studying the fortifications. Historians are reconstructing her reign from fragmentary evidence. Africans are teaching their children about the queens and kings and civilizations that colonialism tried to erase. The silence is breaking. But here's what matters. This story isn't just about the past. It's about the present. It's about who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. It's about whose accomplishments are celebrated and whose are minimized. It's about what narratives we accept and what questions we ask. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, if you believe that history should include everyone who shaped it, not just the victors who wrote it down, if you believe that Africa's history wasn't lost, it was buried, and it's time to dig it up, then subscribe to Ancient Africa Untold, because Queen Amina isn't the only one. She's not the only powerful African ruler who's been erased. She's not the only woman whose accomplishments were minimized or sexualized or dismissed. She's not the only story that colonialism tried to bury. There are hundreds more, thousands more, and they all deserve to be told, because Africa's history wasn't lost. It was buried, on purpose, by people who knew exactly what they were doing. And once you know the truth, once you understand how deliberate the erasure was, how sophisticated the systems of historical suppression were, how much of what you learned was shaped by ideologies that required your ignorance, you can't unknow it. Queen Amina built an empire. She commanded armies. She revolutionized warfare. She created infrastructure that lasted centuries, and the world tried to forget her name. But you know it now, and that changes everything.